Okay, welcome back, juniors. This is our last new content, new stuff you're learning lesson, and then we're gonna do just review from now till the end. Every time with review, though, you're gonna do some document analysis because that's what we need to work on the most, based just on some of our DBQs. So go ahead, make sure those Cornell notes are open, and you're taking down some notes, writing some questions, and then I'll explain what the second half of this assignment is. So the last lecture we talked about World War II in general, like how it started, who fought in it, what the US did military-wise. But World War II is an interesting time also because of what was happening during the home front, in particular with minority identities, or not men, basically, not white men, basically. Cool. So we talked about this in the last lecture, but the pretty significant change during World War II is a good number of women are working, and this includes married women and women with children. So throughout history, we've heard of women working, but it's mostly like single women, young women. Once they get married and have kids, they stop. World War II is when everyone starts to get into working, manufacturing, and even some traditional men roles. Like you see here, these are women pilots. They would test out the planes before sending them to the men. 1/3 of the labor force during this time was women, and about 350,000 women were actually in the military. So women couldn't fight in combat, though, and that's still a thing today in the military, but they would do things like here where they're building and testing the planes for the men. Even during this time, the government set up childcare so women could drop their kids off, work at a factory, and go pick them up. This was really temporary, though. So once the war ended and all the men came back, it was almost like required that women quit their jobs for the men to be able to work. Cool. So what we see is like, wow, this is a lot of big growth and a lot of big change, but then the women just have to quit their jobs anyway. It also created this idea of economic freedom, considering the New Deal, but also considering with the war and what was happening at the time. This is where you get what is called the GI Bill. So essentially what this is if you are in the military, the government will give you money for certain things, like owning a house, going to college, things like that. This time is also noted for being plural, or having American pluralism, which is essentially this brotherhood idea that all these people, everybody from different backgrounds, different races, different ethnicities, are all living together to promote freedom and democracy and to win this war. And it was definitely a propaganda plug of diverse equality. We allow so many diverse people and we create equality among them as a way to sort of convince people Nazism is not a good thing. Look at what they're doing, stuff like that. So this is where we're going to get into the rest of the lecture, because we need to decide, is it true? Did they really create a plural society or not? So we'll start with Mexican Americans, Mexican immigrants. So during World War II, the Bracero program was initiated, which is open immigration between Mexico and the U.S. So Mexican workers could come up into the United States and work in certain jobs, particularly agriculture and factory jobs. In order to fight for freedom, it was a partnership between Mexico and the U.S. It actually lasted until 1964, so even beyond World War II. About 4.5 million people entered the United States under this program. So it was a pretty big deal, pretty big program, and the first sort of open immigration, in theory, between the two countries. You also had Native American tribes getting involved in the war. Native Americans, as if you remember, were mostly forced onto reservations, and they kind of weren't involved in U.S. politics or issues. During the war, though, Native Americans either were drafted or by choice left their reservations to fight in World War II. In fact, the Iroquois declared war on Germany, so because they're their own nation, they can do that. The most famous example of Native Americans being a part of the war effort is called the Navajo Code Talkers. So the Navajo language is really complex. And so they would transmit messages to US troops. Someone would know the language. And it would be really hard for it to be deciphered, particularly among the Chinese. So they were pretty instrumental in getting out some pretty important messages. Okay, we could say there's some different things coming for Asian Americans, particularly Japanese Americans. So first things first, Japan invaded China, if you remember. So the US then considered China an ally. And so Chinese Americans, they did things to convince them to be a part of the war effort, like eliminating the Chinese Exclusion Act, helping Chinese join the army. But Japanese Americans, because there was a war against Japan and because of Pearl Harbor, it really instigated a race war. So the war in Germany was characterized like a war of freedom, whereas the war against Japan was definitely characterized as a race war and stereotyping Japanese and the Japanese stereotyping the US. In particular, though, the US would use propaganda very much stereotyping Japanese to say like, oh, they're evil, they're awful kind of thing, which they didn't do the same for the Germans or the Italians. What else happened for Japanese Americans is internment. This is because of Pearl Harbor. There was an increased sort of racism / unfounded suspicion towards anyone of Japanese ancestry, whether they were citizens or not. And so FDR signed in an Executive Order 9066, which basically relocated tons of Japanese families from the West Coast, in California in particular, because that's where they tended to live, into internment camps, most of the time in places like Utah, New Mexico, Colorado. These internment camps were essentially like prison, if you look here. So they'd be forced into this housing. They wouldn't be able to leave. The army would control when they would feed them, when they could do things, and all that fun stuff. And there was no due process. So if you were like, oh, I'm not going to go, I'm actually a U.S. citizen, you didn't get the chance to actually go to court if you were a Japanese American. In fact, the Supreme Court ruled in Korematsu versus U.S. that the internment policy in and of itself is not racist, even though it's targeting one group of people, but that it was in the matter of national defense. Which is interesting. So this happened during World War II. Nothing really came of this until 1988, when there was an apology from Congress and money was given out to any relatives of anybody who was in an internment camp or people still alive in internment camps. Also, Japanese Americans were sometimes forcefully drafted into the U.S. Army or Navy, and they were forced to pledge allegiance. So even within these internment camps, they would be forced to say the Pledge of Allegiance every day to prove that they were American citizens. So hands down, Japanese Americans, the way the government treated them really tests that narrative of pluralism and equality and acceptance of diversity. And last is African Americans. So before World War II, African Americans were in the Army, but in particular, they weren't drafted as much for racist policies, and they were segregated. They were not given the chance to do things. World War II shifted that for a couple of reasons. First, because of everyone fighting overseas, women are getting jobs and other people are getting jobs. So you have a massive migration from the South of African Americans, about 700,000, to industrial cities in the North to work in factories. So thinking Detroit, Chicago, all of those places. You also had African Americans being drafted or signing up themselves, and they would not be barred from serving in the military based on race. That being said, they would still be segregated. So there would be an all African American platoon and a white platoon. And after the war, when we were talking about the GI Bill and stuff, the same sort of benefits were not granted equally among African Americans. So in theory, they would have them, but there would be red tape and barriers preventing them from going to the college of their choice or buying the house of their choice that they wanted. Also, because of segregation happening in the US, you start to see this narrative of, well, why are we any better than Germany, right? Like, yes, we don't have the Holocaust here, but we are clearly oppressing and repressing an entire group of people through the government. And this is where a lot of people say that the start of the civil rights movement sort of began, the seed was planted, because thousands of African Americans are sacrificing their lives for freedom and liberty in the US that they also don't get themselves. And so it's like this idea of how can there be freedom with segregation in the South? Cool. So that was a pretty short lecture, I think. So let's explain what you're doing. So you're doing document analysis again. The first thing I want you to do is make sure you review these key points. I took away intended audience because I was getting irritated by everyone saying the intended audience is U.S. citizens, like not very profound thinking at all. So when you're analyzing documents, you're only going to either do historical context, point of view, or purpose. There's a prompt here. I just want you to write a draft thesis statement because you should be using your thesis or your argument to help you analyze documents. And then you're going to choose 3 documents. There's 4 altogether to analyze. And you're only choosing one of the hips, but not the I. So historical context, purpose, or point of view. You should be using notes from this lecture, notes from that last lecture to help you with historical context. Cool. Hopefully this isn't too long. I think it's fine. And I'll see you guys later.